July 26, 1945. The votes from Britain's first election in 10 years are counted. Winston Churchill waits at his country home for the results. He's confident. His approval rating is 83%. He just led Britain to victory over Nazi Germany. The war in Europe ended only 12 weeks ago. Churchill expects a landslide victory. The results come in. Churchill is stunned. Labour has won 393 seats. The Conservatives only 197. Labour's leader, Clement Attlee, has a majority of 146 seats. It's the largest electoral swing in modern British history, 12% from Conservative to Labour. Churchill goes to Buckingham Palace and resigns. Attlee arrives minutes later and becomes Prime Minister. King George VI, displeased with the socialist victory, greets Attlee with uncomfortable silence. Attlee finally says, "I've won the election." The king replies coldly, "I know, I heard it on the 6 o'clock news." This moment changes Britain forever. Attlee's government will create the National Health Service, nationalize 20% of the economy, and build the modern welfare state. But it will also inherit a nation close to bankruptcy. National debt is 249% of GDP. The empire is unsustainable, resources are scarce, food rationing continues. For decades, historians have debated, did Churchill's defeat delay Britain's recovery, or did Attlee's socialist policies burden the economy with costs it couldn't afford? Let's start with why Churchill lost. The man who saved Britain from Hitler was rejected by voters less than 3 months after victory. How? Several reasons. First, voters didn't trust the Conservative Party. They remember the 1930s, mass unemployment, the means test, appeasement of Hitler. A book called Guilty Men, published in 1940, accused the pre-Churchill Conservative government of failing to rearm Britain and submitting to Hitler's bullying. Neville Chamberlain's Munich Agreement, which sanctioned Germany's annexation of Czechoslovakia, was widely seen as a humiliating mistake. Yes, Churchill opposed appeasement, but he was a conservative. Voters associated the party with failure, not Churchill's individual heroism. Second, Labour offered a vision for peacetime. Churchill's campaign focused on his wartime leadership and warned against socialism. Labour's manifesto, Let Us Face the Future, offered concrete policies: full employment, a national health service providing free health care to everyone, nationalization of coal, railways, steel, housing for working families, social security from cradle to grave. Churchill made a disastrous campaign speech on June 4, 1945. He accused Labour of harboring socialist dictatorial ambitions. He said Labour would have to fall back on some sort of Gestapo to push through its reforms. Comparing Attlee to the Nazis was outrageously offensive. Voters had just finished fighting actual fascists. Attlee responded brilliantly. He said Churchill's speech showed he was ill-suited to peacetime leadership. The Gestapo remark backfired spectacularly. It revealed Churchill as a man of war, not peace. Third, Labour had proven competence during the war. Churchill invited Labour into the wartime coalition government in May 1940. Attlee became Deputy Prime Minister in 1942. Ernest Bevin ran the Ministry of Labour, organizing the Home Front. Herbert Morrison ran the Home Office. Labour politicians managed key domestic ministries throughout the war. Voters saw that Labour could govern responsibly. They weren't radical revolutionaries. They were experienced administrators. Fourth, soldiers wanted change. About 73% of eligible voters participated. Many were soldiers voting from overseas. The vote counting took 3 weeks to gather all ballots from troops stationed across the world. These soldiers remembered unemployment before the war. They'd seen poverty. They wanted guarantees that peacetime wouldn't mean joblessness. Labour promised full employment. The Conservatives didn't. Fifth, housing was a crisis. Bombing had destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes. Families were living in overcrowded, substandard conditions. Labour promised massive council house construction programs. The Conservatives offered vague commitments. Voters wanted specifics. The final tally was devastating for Churchill. Labour received 47.7% of the vote to the Conservatives, 36.2%. Nearly 12 million people voted Labour, compared to 9 million for Conservatives. Labour won 393 seats, Conservatives only 197. The swing of 12 percentage points remains the largest in post-war British electoral history. Academics later rated Attlee as the most successful 20th century British Prime Minister with a score of 8.3 out of 10. Churchill didn't even make the top 5, so what did Attlee's government do? Immediately, they began implementing the Beveridge Report. This was a 1942 official study recommending a welfare state to insure people from the cradle to the grave. The National Insurance Act in 1946 created Social Security. Workers paid flat-rate contributions. In return, they received pensions, sickness benefits, unemployment benefits, and funeral benefits. The National Assistance Act 1948 provided support for those who couldn't work. The government also established the National Health Service in July 1948. For the first time, healthcare was free at the point of use based on citizenship and need, not ability to pay. Millions of people received medical and dental care for the first time. NHS spending increased over 80% between 1948 and 1951, from 2.1% of GDP to 3.6%. The NHS quickly became the cornerstone of British national life. Attlee's government also nationalised key industries. By 1951, about 20% of the British economy was publicly owned. The Bank of England was nationalised in 1946. Coal, railways, road haulage, and canals were nationalised in 1947. Electricity and gas followed in 1948. Steel in 1951. The rationale was that these industries were essential infrastructure. Private ownership had led to underinvestment and poor service. Public ownership would modernize them and ensure they served the public interest. Housing was another priority. Over 1 million new homes were built between 1945 and 1951. 4 out of 5 were council properties built to better standards than before the war. Subsidies kept rents affordable. For the first time, many low-income families had access to decent housing. The scale of these reforms was unprecedented. Britain built a comprehensive welfare state in just 6 years, but all of this cost money, enormous amounts of money. So here's the question. Did the welfare state delay Britain's economic recovery? Critics argue, yes, resources that should have gone into rebuilding export industries went into social programs instead. The NHS, pensions, housing subsidies, all required government spending. High taxes discouraged investment and growth. Nationalized industries were inefficient and unprofitable. The government controlled too much of the economy. Innovation stagnated. Britain fell behind West Germany and France, which focused on industrial reconstruction, not welfare programs. Defenders argue no, the welfare state was essential for social stability. Without it, Britain risked strikes, unrest, political instability. Workers who fought in the war deserved decent health care and housing. Full employment policies kept demand high, supporting economic growth. Nationalization modernized decrepit industries that private owners had neglected. The coal industry, for example, was inefficient and dangerous before nationalization. Public ownership improved safety and working conditions. The electricity and gas industries became, in historian Eric Shaw's words, impressive models of public enterprise. The evidence is mixed. On one hand, Britain's economy grew during the Attlee years. Unemployment stayed low. Returning veterans were successfully reabsorbed into society. The Great Depression didn't return. Trade balances improved by 1949 after the pound was devalued by 30%. By 1951, exports were stronger. On the other hand, living standards remained low. Rationing continued throughout the Attlee years. Bread was rationed for the first time in 1946, after the war had ended. Food shortages persisted. Consumer goods were scarce. Housing remained inadequate. The winter of 1947 was brutal. Fuel shortages froze the economy. Power cuts were common. Historian Peter Hennessy describes the Attlee years as an age of austerity. The country struggled. Everyday life was drab and colorless. People were exhausted from 6 years of war, followed by 6 years of belt-tightening. Was this Attlee's fault, or was it inevitable? Britain's economy had been shattered by the war. $34 billion in costs. Overseas investments sold off. Shipping losses. Industrial capacity diverted to war production for 6 years. The empire was collapsing. India gained independence in 1947, taking with it a major captive market and source of tax revenue. Britain couldn't maintain global commitments. Any government would have faced these problems. Churchill acknowledged this. After the 1945 defeat, his wife Clementine called it a blessing in disguise. Churchill gruffly replied, "It's very effectively disguised." Later, when someone said voters were ungrateful, Churchill disagreed. He said, "They have had a very tough time." Churchill understood the British people were exhausted. They wanted change. The Conservative program was vague. It focused on Churchill's leadership, but offered few specifics for peacetime reconstruction. The Conservative Manifesto, a declaration of policy to the electorate, made broad commitments to free enterprise and anti-socialism, but lacked detailed plans for housing, healthcare, or employment. Did Churchill's absence from power in 1945 to 1951 delay recovery? Probably not. The fundamental problems, debt, destroyed infrastructure, loss of empire, would have existed under any leader. Churchill's strengths were in war leadership and foreign policy. His interests lay in grand strategy in confronting the Soviet Union. He cared less about domestic policy. Attlee, by contrast, focused relentlessly on domestic reconstruction. He delegated foreign policy to Ernest Bevin. Attlee managed the implementation of welfare reforms, nationalization, and housing programs with quiet efficiency. This was not glamorous work. It required administrative competence, not inspirational speeches. Attlee excelled at it. Churchill might not have. There's also a counterfactual question. What would Churchill have done differently? The Conservative Manifesto offered similar policies to Labour in many areas. Both parties supported Beveridge's welfare state proposals, at least in principle. Both accepted some nationalization. The wartime coalition government had already committed to post-war reforms. Churchill's government would likely have implemented scaled-back versions of the same policies. Perhaps a smaller NHS, less nationalization, lower spending, but the direction would have been similar. The real debate is whether Britain overinvested in welfare at the expense of industrial modernization. West Germany provides a comparison. Germany focused on industrial reconstruction under the Marshall Plan. It invested heavily in factories, machinery, infrastructure. Social programs were more limited. By the 1950s, West Germany's economy was booming, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Germany's industrial output soared, exports grew, living standards rose rapidly. Britain, meanwhile, grew more slowly. By the 1960s, Germany and France had higher GDP per capita than Britain. Some economists argue this proves Britain made the wrong choice. Others counter that Germany had advantages Britain lacked. Germany received proportionally more Marshall Plan aid. Germany's currency was devalued more aggressively, making exports competitive. Germany faced fewer imperial burdens. Britain was defending colonies and commitments globally. Germany could focus solely on domestic growth. There's also the question of whether the welfare state was affordable in the long term. The NHS costs spiraled. By 1951, Labour faced internal divisions over NHS funding. Health spending jumped from $6 billion to $11 billion, an 83% increase. Chancellor Stafford Cripps resigned due to illness in 1950. Aneurin Bevan, the architect of the NHS, resigned in 1951 over prescription charges introduced to fund rearmament for the Korean War. Labour's 1950 election victory had reduced their majority to just 5 seats. Internal conflicts weakened the government. In October 1951, another election was called. Labour actually won more votes than the Conservatives, nearly 14 million to 13.7 million. But due to Britain's electoral system, the Conservatives won more seats. Churchill returned as Prime Minister at age 76. He served until 1955. During these years, Churchill largely continued Attlee's policies. The NHS remained. Nationalised industries stayed public. Council House building continued. The Conservatives accepted the post-war consensus. They didn't dismantle the welfare state. They couldn't. It was too popular. This consensus lasted until 1979 when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Thatcher rejected the post-war settlement. She privatized nationalized industries. She reduced government spending. She weakened unions. Thatcher argued that Attlee's policies had created dependency and stagnation. Britain needed free markets, not state control. Thatcher's reforms were controversial, but they transformed Britain's economy. Whether for better or worse remains debated. So did Churchill delay Britain's recovery by losing in 1945? No. Britain's recovery would have been slow and painful regardless of who governed. The war's damage was too severe. Debt was too high. Empire was too costly to maintain. The real question is whether Attlee's welfare state was the right priority. Supporters say yes. It provided social stability, prevented a return to 1930s mass unemployment, and created institutions like the NHS that remain fundamental to British society today. Critics say no. It diverted resources from industrial investment, created inefficiencies through nationalization, and established unsustainable spending commitments that burdened future generations. The truth is probably both. The welfare state was morally necessary after 6 years of war and sacrifice. British people deserved health care, housing, and security. But it came at a cost. Industrial modernization was slower. Productivity lagged behind competitors. By the 1970s, Britain was the sick man of Europe. Whether this was caused by the welfare state or by other factors, loss of empire, poor management, class divisions, weak investment culture, remains contested. What's clear is that Churchill's 1945 defeat didn't delay recovery. It changed the direction of recovery. Britain chose social solidarity over industrial dynamism, welfare over wealth, security over growth. That choice defined Britain for 30 years. Whether it was the right choice depends on your values. Do you prioritize healthcare for all or economic growth, social safety nets, or competitive advantage? There's no objectively correct answer. But the consequences of the 1945 choice shaped Britain's trajectory for generations. Churchill lost the 1945 election not because he failed Britain, but because Britain wanted something different than what he offered. They wanted peace, security, and a new social contract. Attlee delivered that. The cost was slower economic growth and relative decline. But for millions of ordinary Britons, the NHS and welfare state were worth it. That's the legacy of 1945. Not delay, but transformation.